Translating directly from Latin, the phrase Puer Aeternus signifies the concept of a perpetual child. This specific terminology originally surfaced within the pages of the Metamorphoses, a foundational masterpiece penned by the Roman poet Ovid. In these ancient texts, the youthful deity Icarus receives reverence for his vital participation in the Eleusinian mysteries, which were highly secretive and celebrated initiatory rites dedicated to Hellenic goddesses. As eras passed, this juvenile divinity became intertwined with figures like Bacchus, also known as Dionysus, as well as Eros, ultimately representing a divine embodiment of vitality, mortality, rebirth, and everlasting youth. Decades later, the eminent Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung revived this classical mythological concept to investigate the persistent childish spirit and unending adolescence embedded within the human mind. Should this psychological pattern manifest in a woman, it is correspondingly labeled with a Latin term Puer Aeternus. Functioning as a foundational archetype, a core structural building block of our mental architecture, it naturally possesses both beneficial and detrimental characteristics. On one hand, it can infuse a mature existence with the vibrancy, aesthetic appreciation, and inventiveness of youth. Conversely, it harbors the destructive potential to obstruct personal evolution, condemning you to navigate a labyrinth of juvenile delusions where reality feels akin to continuous confinement. As the initial archetypal pattern you encounter upon entering the world, this youthful paradigm maintains a profound influence across your entire lifespan, holding deep ties to the mother archetype. An individual gripped by the puer or puella complex actively resists the process of individuation, effectively waging war against their own instinctual push toward complete psychological integration. Consequently, their emotional and mental maturation grinds to a devastating halt. Although these individuals often possess extraordinary visionary capacities and a vibrant internal universe, they fail to actualize these gifts into their waking consciousness. Thus, their latent talents remain profoundly buried and squandered within the cavernous realms of the subconscious. Consider the cinematic narrative of The Matrix, where the protagonist, Neo, faces a critical decision between two distinct capsules. Consuming the blue pill promises continuous comfort within a fabricated illusion, perfectly encapsulating the philosophy that blissful ignorance is preferable to hard facts. Conversely, the red pill forces an encounter with brutal authenticity, launching the consumer on a demanding journey toward genuine self-actualization. Understandably, the perennial child instinctively gravitates toward the blue option to avoid any inherent discomfort. If you ever observe an inability to sustain professional duties, forge meaningful interpersonal connections, endure the rigorous discipline of education, shoulder adult burdens, or if you simply grapple with profound existential emptiness, purposefully assimilating this archetype of eternal youth could prove exceptionally transformative for your personal journey. The esteemed Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz provides a comprehensive breakdown of this phenomenon in her seminal text, Puer Aeternus, a psychological study of the adult struggle with the paradise of childhood. She utilizes the detrimental facets of this concept to describe an adult male chronically trapped in his teenage years, a condition almost universally paired with an overwhelming reliance on his maternal figure. While a mother's instinct inherently drives her to shield her offspring, perpetually insulating a child prevents him from developing the resilience necessary to navigate inevitable future hardships. Consequently, the ill-prepared adult retreats from society's unforgiving landscape, running back to the nurturing sanctuary of maternal protection in a subconscious temptation to revert to the safety of the womb, thereby forging a debilitating mother complex. Embodying the classic man-child, this individual vehemently rejects the maturation process, dodging accountability and demanding that external figures, most often his parents, resolve his ongoing dilemmas. Bereft of any genuine enthusiasm for acquiring knowledge, he subsequently fails to cultivate a profound comprehension of any subject matter whatsoever. Marie-Louise von Franz articulates this behavioral trap, noting that these people habitually struggle with employment because no position ever perfectly aligns with their idealized expectations. They constantly perceive a fatal flaw in every scenario. Similarly, romantic partners are perpetually deemed inadequate, viewed merely as pleasant companions until an inevitable reservation surfaces, permanently sabotaging the possibility of marriage or binding dedication. Acutely conscious of mortality's fleeting nature, the eternal adolescent pointlessly guards his heart, refusing to immerse himself entirely in any passing experience. Harboring the cynical conviction that every endeavor culminates in sorrow and separation, he remains in a state of constant departure. This relentless preparation for goodbyes inadvertently accelerates the demise of his pursuits, falsely validating his own pessimistic biases. This morbid strategy of preemptively bracing for agony serves as a typical pathological shield. By projecting inevitable letdowns to blunt the emotional impact, he effectively executes a total refusal to live. While he interprets this chronic overthinking as rational self-preservation, this excessive rumination acts as a paralyzing affliction, trapping him inside an impenetrable psychological sphere of hyper-consciousness that completely disconnects him from authentic existence. Engaging authentically with reality terrifies the perpetual boy, because it mandates acknowledging his own physical vulnerability and the decaying nature of the corruptible world around him. This psychological hurdle mirrors ancient mythological narratives where humanity's expulsion from paradise, a symbolic representation of the ultimate archetypal maternal womb, forces an abrupt recognition of mortal fragility and inherent incompleteness. To onlookers, this individual frequently appears trapped in a lethargic stupor, practically begging for a metaphorical splash of freezing water to shock him into wakefulness. Yet, this sluggish exterior serves merely as a deceptive facade. Peeling back the layers reveals a person fiercely guarding a remarkably elaborate and treasured internal dreamscape. Deep within this mental sanctuary, the puer risks spiraling into delusions of grandeur, envisioning himself as an unparalleled intellect, an unrecognized prodigy, or an epoch-defining philosopher, all while completely failing to produce any concrete evidence of his supposed brilliance. He ultimately becomes an artist utterly devoid of art. Preferring to squander his energy on passive daydreaming, he entirely ignores the constructive psychological exercises of active imagination championed by Carl Jung. Ironically, indulging in endless fantasies of triumph rather than pragmatically visualizing potential obstacles drastically increases his susceptibility to ultimate defeat. As Jung incisively observed, such a person navigates a strictly provisional existence, paralyzed by the terror of committing to circumstances they cannot easily abandon. Thus, tomorrow's ambitions dissolve into hollow musings about what could be, completely devoid of any resolute action to enact real change. Craving ultimate autonomy, this archetype fiercely resists boundaries and views any form of constraint as completely unbearable. The concept of the provisional life captures a fundamentally detached mindset, one that floats in an imaginary realm rather than grounding itself in present reality. Individuals caught in this pattern maintain a peculiar conviction that their current employment, residence, vehicle, artistic pursuits, or romantic partnerships are merely temporary substitutes, holding space until their authentic destiny eventually materializes. Carl Jung aptly characterized this phenomenon as a contemporary affliction rooted entirely in an existence built on illusions. Because embracing obligation demands a structured way of living, the Puer Aeternus actively avoids any serious commitments. Retreating into a vibrant mental dreamscape, this individual seeks fleeting solace, far above the demands of everyday existence. In an effort to ascend as far from tangible reality as possible, they mirror Peter Pan, the legendary youth who refused maturity and chose to reside in Neverland, a mythical domain of perpetual childhood and suspended time. Consequently, this psychological condition is widely recognized as the Peter Pan syndrome, a pervasive developmental hurdle that plagues contemporary society with alarming frequency. Lacking a solidified core identity, these individuals frequently battle unsettling sensations of insignificance and internal division. To mask this creeping despair and the threat of psychological unraveling, they frantically chase intense dopamine rushes through substance abuse, reckless sports, intimacy, or dangerous adventures. These thrilling extremes offer a temporary mirage of wholeness, momentarily satisfying their desperate craving for emotional equilibrium. Ultimately, someone trapped in a provisional state remains completely estranged from their actual circumstances, squandering their days obsessing over fruitless daydreams that yield zero tangible results. An ancient Greek tale perfectly illustrates this peril through the story of the astrologer who fell into a well, wherein Thales of Miletus, often regarded as the original philosopher, tumbled into a deep pit because his eyes were entirely fixated on the cosmos. This myth poses a vital question. How can you truly comprehend lofty celestial mysteries if you remain entirely oblivious to the solid ground supporting your steps? Although gifted with a brilliantly active mind, the eternal youth completely fails to translate these profound visions into concrete deeds, floating in an abstract atmosphere while completely bypassing the gritty, visceral realities of earthly existence. Consequently, profound, practical failure often characterizes their waking lives. The psychoanalyst Marie-Louise von Franz perfectly captured this tragic routine, noting how such an individual might languish in bed until mid-morning, casually smoking, and drifting through whimsical thoughts until the afternoon. Despite vague intentions to accomplish actual tasks, their time inevitably slips away through casual socializing, romantic distractions, and endless philosophical debates stretching deep into the night, only to repeat this exact cycle upon waking. Through this endless looping, immense internal potential slowly rots away, suffocating the person's authentic character instead of blooming into something worthwhile. Drifting through an engaging but entirely theoretical cloud of unfulfilled promises, you can clearly sense their staggering hidden talents, yet recognize the total impossibility of those gifts ever materializing in the real world. Curiously, these individuals often possess a remarkable ability to absorb information and feign deep understanding, giving the false impression that profound behavioral changes are imminent. However, lacking any foundational roots in practicality, they invariably fail to execute a single lesson they have absorbed. They engage in a deceptive psychological maneuver where the very concept of engaging with reality remains a purely academic exercise, beautifully resolved within their minds but completely ignored in practice. Bridging the gap between conceptualization and execution remains an insurmountable obstacle for them. Interestingly, the term human finds its linguistic roots in the Latin word humus, translating to soil or earth, reminding us that genuine humanity requires humility, a grounded nature, and a deep connection to the nourishing, healing grit of physical reality. This archetype closely mirrors the tragic figure of Icarus from classical mythology, a boy who received explicit warnings against arrogant pride and the dangers of soaring too near the blazing sun. Disregarding wise counsel, his foolish ascent melted his artificial wings, sending him plummeting into the violent ocean waves below to his ultimate demise. Analyzing this detached state of being, Jung observed that living provisionally turns a person into a mere observer of their own timeline, stripping away authentic existence. In this shadow state, every encounter feels hauntingly insubstantial and entirely theoretical, completely lacking the weight of true, lived experience. highlighting the fatal consequences of this disconnect. Jung recounted the heartbreaking case of a 25-year-old woman whose severe detachment ultimately culminated in taking her own life. Despite his best clinical efforts, she remained psychologically unreachable behind an impenetrable wall of apathy. While she went through the physical motions of daily routines, she lacked any conscious connection to her own actions or experiences. Because she had completely severed all ties to the tangible world, absolutely no intervention could pierce her isolation, and she tragically ended her life with a firearm shortly after. Recalling the tragic aftermath, Jung described viewing the young woman's body after she had suffered a fatal chest wound in a public street, noting that she likely survived for a fleeting moment post-injury. He spent a considerable amount of time studying her dramatically transformed facial features, deeply pondering the bizarre emotion frozen there. He compared her mesmerizing visage to someone who had fiercely defended a deeply held false belief, only to be abruptly and undeniably presented with the actual truth. Her face radiated a mixture of total confusion, coupled with an eerie, delighted astonishment. In that final, fatal instant of self-destruction, Jung deduced that she had finally grasped the true essence of reality for the very first time. Tragically, it sometimes requires catastrophic personal harm for individuals to shatter their illusions and awaken to the genuine nature of their existence. This harsh truth exposes the terrifying depths of unconsciousness that many people unknowingly navigate daily. For psychological health, our internal dreamscapes and our external realities must constantly inform and balance one another. When the mind becomes permanently trapped in Neverland, paralyzed by an absolute dependence on imagination, the essential transition into mature adulthood becomes utterly impossible. As this developmental stagnation reaches critical mass, suppressed forces begin flooding the psyche, threatening to completely submerge the conscious self, proving the old psychological adage that unexpressed potential eventually turns toxic and attacks its host. Conversely, we must also acknowledge the inverse tragedy: neglected youths who are violently thrust into maturity far too early, representing the absolute polar opposite of the eternal child. Severe life challenges often compel these individuals to adopt a hyper-realistic, fiercely independent, and profoundly cynical worldview. You'll typically notice a premature, bitter maturity on their faces, signaling that their formative years were abruptly cut short. Stripped of the enchanting wonder of eternal youth, these people find themselves unable to experience genuine love or trust, rendering their existence seemingly meaningless and leaving them feeling permanently detached from reality. To address this profound disconnect, a therapist must undertake the delicate process of helping them reconnect with those forgotten early fantasies, ensuring these buried emotions are appropriately processed. Conversely, the eternal child archetype harbors profound positive attributes, particularly a deep spirituality born from an intimate connection with the unconscious mind. The Puer radiates an engaging, youthful charm and frequently initiates deeply stimulating dialogues, emerging as a divine symbol of untapped potential, continuous growth, and optimistic futures. Friedrich Nietzsche clearly recognized this profound significance, identifying the childlike state as the ultimate transformation required to achieve one's true self. The philosopher eloquently described the child as a manifestation of innocence, a fresh start, and a sacred affirmation of existence, declaring that the act of creation absolutely demands this profound affirmative stance toward life. When we discuss the inner child, we are actually referring to a quality that blossoms out of true adult maturity, representing a purposeful advancement toward psychological completeness, rather than a slide back into immaturity. Every single one of us harbors this youthful essence, which is why you occasionally witness even the elderly reverting to a state of radiant, unblemished innocence. This eternal youth remains completely absorbed in the present moment, bubbling with awe and playful energy that ultimately fuels unadulterated creative expression. By wholeheartedly embracing existence, this archetype effectively grounds divine joy in physical reality, echoing the biblical sentiment that true spiritual enlightenment requires you to radically shift your perspective and become like a little child. Advancing in age inevitably introduces us to the realm of the senex, the Latin term for the old man, an archetype that carries its own distinct blend of constructive and destructive traits. In its most favorable light, this figure embodies the quintessential wise sage, an individual who is remarkably balanced, exceptionally patient, steadfastly conscientious, and deeply grounded in self-control. However, the shadow side of the senex manifests as severe rigidity, bitter cynicism, entrenched materialism, and a stark inability to appreciate humor or adapt to shifting circumstances. While this older figure stands in direct opposition to the Puer archetype, you must view them as two vital halves of a single whole, just as our comprehension of youth relies entirely on our familiarity with aging. Carl Jung illuminated this duality by describing the senex as the shadow of the puer, aligning the former with the disciplined, highly rational, and profoundly ordered nature of the god Apollo. Conversely, he linked the shadow of the senex to the puer, associating it with the wild, instinctual, and intoxicating chaos of Dionysus. Where the youthful archetype envisions grandiose dreams, the elder archetype commits to rigorous labor, and while the internal proportion of these two forces differs for every individual, both are absolutely crucial for maintaining true psychological well-being. Permitting either extreme to dominate your personality is incredibly unwise, particularly because these two powerful archetypes approach the concept of leisure and play from vastly different perspectives. The youthful spirit delights in experiential, intangible activities such as competitive sports, vibrant social gatherings, or cinematic outings, whereas the older spirit finds recreation in producing concrete results through hobbies like painting, culinary arts, or structural building. Jung himself predominantly embodied the senex, channeling his energy into sculpting, engraving stones, drafting complex mandalas, and compiling his famously intricate Red Book from deep psychological imagery. During an immensely challenging era he labeled his confrontation with the unconscious, he experienced intense psychological turmoil and desperately scoured his early memories to pinpoint the source of his distress. When this intense retrospection only highlighted his profound lack of understanding, he resolved to surrender completely to whatever spontaneous impulses naturally arose within his mind. Documenting this crucial turning point, Jung noted that his very first resurfaced memory transported him back to around his 10th or 11th year, an era when he was utterly captivated by the simple act of constructing miniature castles and houses. He was genuinely astounded by the powerful surge of emotion tied to these mental images, leading him to conclude that a vibrant, creative little boy still thrived inside him, possessing an imaginative vitality he desperately needed to reclaim. Realizing he had severely marginalized his youthful essence, he felt initially embarrassed by the prospect of engaging in juvenile activities during his advanced years. Despite his reservations, he began deliberately collecting rocks and meticulously assembling a tiny, detailed village. This constructive play became a daily ritual performed right after lunch before attending to his clinical patients, and he would eagerly resume the task whenever his evening schedule permitted. Through this repetitive physical engagement, his mental fog dissipated, unlocking a profound wellspring of artistic passion, immense enthusiasm, and a total psychological rebirth. He later described this specific period as a critical juncture in his destiny, explaining that this simple recreational activity functioned as a catalyst, unleashing a massive flood of internal imagery that he would subsequently document with meticulous care. Ultimately, his most grandiose manifestation of mature recreation culminated in a 12-year endeavor to construct the Tower at Bollingen, a deeply secluded natural retreat situated along the shores of Lake Zurich. Dedicating several months annually to this sanctuary, he effectively replenished his spiritual reserves, declaring that within those walls he experienced his most authentic existence. This complex interplay of archetypes is equally visible in Antoine de Saint-Exupery, the renowned author of The Little Prince, whose personal life perfectly mirrored the classic traits of the Puer Aeternus. Despite his undeniable literary genius, the acclaimed writer remained drawn to the skies as a professional aviator, a daring path that tragically ended with his fatal plane crash during World War II. I want to point out to you how deeply aviation affected Antoine de Saint-Exupery. Whenever he was forcibly grounded, a profound melancholy would consume him, driving him to pace his apartment endlessly from dawn until dusk in a state of frustrated despair. When you examine his famous book, you will notice it opens with a preamble that reads much like a genuine autobiographical memoir, though the narrative itself is deeply anchored in childlike fantasy and possesses an ethereal, dreamlike quality. I find it fascinating how the storyteller initiates the tale by recalling a childhood memory from age 6, where he learned that boa constrictors consume their victims entirely intact, subsequently lying completely immobilized in a deep slumber for the 6 months required to digest their massive meal. You might perceive the protagonist's initial sketch as rather mundane, yet I believe it perfectly encapsulates the profound enigma of the author's own existence. Upon presenting this supposed masterpiece to the adults in his life and questioning if it incited fear, the elders merely dismissed him, questioning why a simple piece of headwear would cause anyone alarm. However, as I must clarify for you, the illustration was never intended to represent a hat. Rather, it depicted a massive serpent actively breaking down a swallowed elephant within its digestive tract. Because his older peers entirely failed to grasp the visual concept, the young artist was forced to create a second, cross-sectional rendering that explicitly revealed the pachyderm trapped inside the reptile, perfectly illustrating the frustrating reality that mature individuals constantly require exhaustive explanations for the obvious. In response to his creative efforts, the adult strongly recommended that he abandon his artistic pursuits entirely and instead dedicate his mental energy to practical subjects like mathematics, geography, and language structure. Consequently, at the tender age of 6, the boy relinquished a potentially brilliant future in the visual arts, ultimately selecting an alternative vocational path that led him to master aviation and navigate the skies across the globe. Yet, as I want you to note, throughout his travels he would continuously test the mental acuity of any seemingly intelligent adult he encountered by presenting that very first sketch, only to be repeatedly met with the exact same, disappointing identification of a hat. This chronic misunderstanding condemned him to a deeply solitary existence, devoid of any genuine companionship or meaningful conversation. A profound isolation that persisted right up until the fateful moment his aircraft crashed violently in the barren wasteland of the desert. I must emphasize to you that this literary episode closely mirrors a severe trauma from the author's actual life, an ordeal where extreme dehydration brought him to the brink of mortality and subjected his mind to intense hallucinatory visions. While desperately attempting to repair his shattered engine in the scorching sands, the aviator is suddenly interrupted by a peculiar, tiny voice, politely requesting an illustration of a domestic sheep. You soon discover that this voice belongs to an ethereal traveler descended from the cosmos, and when the pilot instinctively offers his standard drawing, the celestial visitor instantly rejects it, correctly identifying the concealed elephant within the serpent. For the very first time, the protagonist encounters a being, a mystical projection of the deeper psyche, who genuinely perceives the world exactly as he does. Lacking any real artistic training, the pilot repeatedly fails to render an acceptable sheep, eventually resorting to sketching a simple crate and cleverly claiming that the requested creature resides safely within, an excuse born from his urgent need to resume mechanical repairs. I see this specific interaction as a powerful symbolic representation of the agonizing friction between our internal psychological needs and the harsh practical requirements of the external world. You will frequently observe an individual manifesting the Puer Aeternus, the archetype of the eternal youth, metaphorically packing their ambitions into a locked container and discarding them out of sheer restlessness. This behavioral pattern represents a critical psychological hazard. Overcoming it requires the eternal youth to cultivate genuine commitment toward a singular pursuit, a core dilemma that the opening chapters of this novella distill perfectly. It becomes increasingly obvious to us that the author himself fundamentally failed to successfully integrate into the rigid framework of mature society, perpetually suffering from a profound sense of melancholy and shattered expectations. Through his writing, I interpret his deeper subconscious urgently pleading with him to engage actively with reality, warning that he cannot indefinitely flee from the sterile and uninspired monotony of routine existence. The desolate setting of the barren wasteland perfectly mirrors his internal landscape, reflecting an agonizing sensation that his very spirit was parched and perishing from emotional dehydration. As you might imagine, enduring such a severe psychological transition during the middle years often triggers a dangerous detachment from one's surroundings, a state of willful distraction where even the most minor miscalculation carries fatal consequences. To the narrator, the sphere of maturity is entirely devoid of the natural world's inherent wonder and the mystical allure so prevalent in folklore. It is, for all intents and purposes, entirely dead. He illustrates this beautifully by describing a distant celestial body inhabited by a crimson-faced businessman who has completely ignored the fragrance of blossoms, the beauty of the cosmos, and the warmth of human affection, dedicating his entire existence solely to mathematical calculations. This tragic figure constantly justifies his bleak existence by arrogantly claiming to be preoccupied with affairs of great importance, a delusion that merely inflates his personal ego. I want you to understand that through this caricature, the author is fiercely criticizing the profound vacuity and foolishness of conventional adulthood, arguing instead that the imaginative, artistic realm of youth is our only authentic mode of being, while the relentless pursuit of financial wealth and social status ultimately destroys our fundamental humanity. The central tragedy here is the protagonist's failure to construct a functional pathway allowing the vibrant authenticity of his early years to transition safely into his mature phase. I am reminded of the British poet William Wordsworth, who powerfully described a similar grief, noting how the natural landscapes, the fields, forests, and rivers, once appeared to him bathed in a divine, radiant glow, resembling the vivid brilliance of a dream. Yet, as Wordsworth observed, that historical magic vanished completely, leaving him unable to witness that extraordinary beauty no matter where he looked, as the restrictive walls of maturity inevitably trap the developing child until the grown adult watches that early brilliance dissolve entirely into the mundane reality of ordinary daylight. Consequently, I pose to you the ultimate philosophical dilemma. How exactly do we achieve maturity without sacrificing that holistic sensation of boundless creativity, mystical wonder, and vibrant vitality that defined our earliest years? When you analyze the underlying psychological currents of the author's biography, I believe his broader potential was entirely consumed by a dominant maternal archetype, an overwhelming force that effectively asphyxiates personal agency and halts all forward development. This dynamic traps the individual in a state of perpetual psychological infancy, forever shielded within a maternal cocoon and entirely unable to step boldly into the challenges of independent adulthood. In this context, the Great Mother transforms into a destructive force of consumption, bearing a striking resemblance to the fierce Hindu goddess Kali. Consequently, the aviator completely fails to initiate his own heroic evolution, an arrested development symbolized directly by the trapped elephant. a creature widely revered as the preeminent champion of the African continent. Unlike typical mythological narratives, where the consumed protagonist eventually breaks free, this particular swallowed champion remains hopelessly imprisoned within its reptilian captor. You must note that the pachyderm is traditionally characterized by immense generosity, profound intelligence, and a quiet demeanor. Yet it is equally prone to explosive emotional volatility that is soothed only through melodic harmony rather than physical indulgence. Remarkably, I find these exact same contradictory traits perfectly defined the personality of Saint-Exupery himself. The elephant symbolizes the internal aspiration of who he yearned to be, a vision ultimately consumed by the archetype of the devouring mother, the backward pulls of the unconscious mind, and eventually, mortality. Although Marie-Louise von Franz noted that Antoine de Saint-Exupery narrowly missed realizing this profound truth, he remained oblivious to it. Grounding the Puer Aeternus requires you to firmly plant your feet in reality, abandoning an exclusive fixation on imagination to fully embrace mundane routines, domestic duties, and rigorous labor. Furthermore, this eternal youth needs to blend into the collective mass, essentially transforming into the very sheep Saint-Exupery concealed within a drawing, despite the inherent risks of such assimilation. Perilous circumstances are often remedied through equally precarious measures, serving as the necessary antidote to sever the suffocating ties of a mother complex. Because it is incredibly rare for a young man to possess the sheer independence required to detach from his mother independently, achieving this separation demands the support of the collective. Consequently, the initial phase of healing requires you to deeply plunge into societal structures, allowing you to encounter genuine human warmth, build meaningful connections, and forge a tribal belonging that eclipses your isolated personal cravings. As you progress to the next stage, you must vigilantly protect your core essence from dissolving entirely into the surrounding populace. It is imperative that you discard the illusions of grandeur and exaggerated uniqueness that mask your full self, while simultaneously guarding your authentic identity from becoming just another anonymous face. You can achieve this delicate equilibrium by harmonizing your communal engagements with profound spiritual reflection, because failing to cultivate solitude prevents the construction of an unshakable internal base, which remains absolutely vital for true self-realization. Friedrich Nietzsche perfectly articulated this tension when he observed that conforming to the crowd forced him into an inauthentic existence, making him feel as though his very soul was being stolen, ultimately driving him to seek the restorative isolation of the desert to reclaim his inner goodness. Carl Jung beautifully illustrated the trajectory of human existence by comparing it to the sun's journey across 12 hours. Dawn represents the birth and beginning of our days, steadily climbing through our formative years until reaching a brilliant zenith at noon. This midday peak symbolizes midlife, marked by maximum vitality and potential professional triumph, before inevitably descending into the twilight of old age and the final sunset of mortality. Each distinct epoch of this solar journey commands entirely different psychological frameworks and core objectives. Throughout the morning phase of existence, Jung posited that your primary mission is to fortify your ego through diligent career building, academic pursuits, and the cultivation of personal relationships. Only upon reaching the afternoon of your timeline do you become firmly rooted enough in the tangible world to pivot your gaze inward, embarking on the profound quest for individuation. When this vital transition is mishandled or resisted, the result is frequently a midlife crisis, which is essentially your spirit crying out desperately for continued evolution. As Jung profoundly explained, the dawn of our existence is undeniably dedicated to establishing ourselves externally, mastering our environment, reproducing, and nurturing the next generation as nature dictates. However, he warned that carrying those youthful imperatives into the afternoon of your years inflicts severe psychological damage, much like a teenager clinging to infantile selfishness will inevitably suffer immense social rejection. Therefore, to effectively dismantle the crippling neurosis characteristic of the Puer Aeternus, you must willingly submit yourself to the demanding crucible of consistent work. The mere concept of labor is incredibly repulsive to the eternal youth, demanding that you surrender the enchanting allure of your boundless imagination in exchange for the mundane obligations of a conventional, responsible lifestyle. To you, relinquishing this perceived exceptionalism in favor of ordinary duty feels like descending into sheer insanity. Yet, the essential challenge requires you to skillfully banish your internal demons, without accidentally exorcising the divine inspiration of your angels in the process. Navigating this treacherous path demands a steadfast commitment to balancing the demands of your external reality with the depths of your internal landscape, which embodies the true essence of individuation. By committing to sustained effort, you actually create the opportunity to achieve genuine greatness in the physical world, rather than remaining a legend solely within your own mind. It is completely irrelevant whether you have discovered your true calling or harbor uncertainties about your optimal career path. The imperative is to anchor yourself to a tangible occupation and dive headfirst into external responsibilities. Soren Kierkegaard eloquently described the ensuing terror as the dizziness of freedom, a profound vertigo induced by staring into an ocean of limitless potential avenues. Within this paralyzing state, you risk either conforming completely to societal expectations and losing your essence, or drowning in the infinite abstract, perpetually analyzing every option without ever taking decisive action. Characteristically, the eternal youth will sample a multitude of professions, only to abandon each one the moment the novelty fades and the monotony sets in. Although fully capable of performing tasks, you will likely perceive all labor as an agonizing burden because you are constantly pushing against the natural current of your own vitality. You may acutely recognize that your chronic indolence is the root cause of your failures, yet you find yourself entirely incapable of generating the desire to overcome this laziness, effectively trapping yourself in a perpetual state of depressive stagnation. Deep within every individual lies a massive reservoir of passion, remaining inaccessible until you successfully integrate the powerful archetype of the Puer Aeternus. Your unconscious mind subtly points toward the avenues where this enthusiasm naturally cascades, given that it is significantly simpler to cultivate discipline when it aligns harmoniously with your innate instincts. Regardless of the chosen profession, however, an inevitable juncture arises where you must confront the stark reality of repetitive routine. Even the most profoundly creative endeavors demand their share of tedious, unglamorous chores, which is precisely the threshold where you, as the eternal youth, typically voice loud resentment. When questioned about the proper way to navigate existence, Carl Jung asserted that no universal predetermined blueprint exists for any individual. If you truly wish to forge your own unique destiny, you must construct that road yourself, a path that remains completely unknown until you courageously take each successive step forward. By simply focusing on executing the immediate task at hand, you will traverse the obscure terrain of life with maximum security, steadily guided by the profound wisdom of your own unconscious mind. As Carl Jung observed, simply agonizing over the ideal way you should navigate existence offers no practical benefit. He advises against squandering our mental energy on fruitless contemplation, suggesting instead that we focus on cultivating the responsibilities immediately before us, thereby aligning our actions with a meaningful destiny. Conversely, the Puer archetype actively resists this call to adventure inherent in the hero's journey, shrinking away from the anxiety that accompanies leaving a familiar past behind. By remaining trapped in a state of denial, this eternal youth fails to cross the threshold into the unknown, actively avoiding the symbolic dragon, which represents their most profound fears or deeply repressed memories, and consequently forfeiting the invaluable inner wealth that this beast protects. Trapped in this perpetual stasis, the eternal youth completely misses the profound revelations that emerge from psychological death and subsequent rebirth. Without shedding the obsolete version of oneself to make way for a more competent identity, the essential process of individuation becomes entirely impossible. Historically, many indigenous cultures recognized this necessity. For instance, certain Native American traditions involved elders abruptly pulling young boys into the untamed wilderness under the cover of darkness to undergo rigorous rites of passage. This dramatic separation marked the true commencement of the hero's journey, where conquering one's inner demons allowed the individual to return to their community no longer a child, but a fully realized adult. Achieving true maturity is vastly distinct from merely growing older. It serves as a hard-won emblem of honor that fosters genuine independence, strengthens the ego, and instills a profound sense of purpose. These vital qualities are conspicuously absent in the pure, whose existence is typically dictated by an overwhelming craving for comfort and security. Jung eloquently noted that true heroes perceive terror as a vital assignment, understanding that courage is the sole remedy for cowardice, and warning that avoiding necessary risks condemns one's future to a bleak, meaningless existence, illuminated only by fleeting illusions. Ultimately, the process of initiation beckons us to boldly cast ourselves into the blazing furnace of reality. In our contemporary society, the absence of these ancient communal rites of passage leaves a significant void, prompting many to seek out modern substitutes, such as military enlistment or intensely regimented fitness subcultures. Deep down, numerous young men secretly yearn to be violently uprooted from the agonizing monotony of their daily routines, fantasizing about being stranded in a harsh environment where they must construct shelters, hunt, and fight to survive. This dual prospect of sheer terror and intense exhilaration highlights a profound psychological reality. They are subconsciously waiting for a dormant archetype to awaken within their minds, hoping it will finally provide them with genuine direction. For a young woman, the transition away from the Puer archetype frequently involves the profound sacrifices associated with embracing motherhood and committed partnership. To fully embody the maternal archetype, she must symbolically surrender the youthful essence of Aphrodite upon the altar of maturity, coming to terms with the irreversible physical and emotional transformations that accompany bringing new life into the world. It is the crushing weight of this immense new responsibility that typically extinguishes the lingering traits of the eternal girl. Naturally, human psychology remains complex, meaning there are certainly mothers who retain their Puella characteristics, just as there are childless women who have completely transcended them. Engaging deeply with our dreams serves as a crucial mechanism for integrating the eternal youth, as this inner child simultaneously manifests as both our regressive past and our potential future. Lingering behind us operates the infantile shadow, a regressive force constantly tempting us toward laziness, dependency, and the evasion of life's demands, which must be consciously sacrificed to awaken our inner hero. Conversely, the divine child, leading us forward, symbolizes boundless renewal and the continuous expansion of our vital energy. As we consciously shift our waking attitudes, our subconscious responds in kind. By meticulously recording, illustrating, and analyzing our nocturnal visions, we can practice active imagination, stepping consciously into these mental landscapes to reshape our psychological reality. Ultimately, our nocturnal visions provide a guiding compass for our waking existence. Even when we struggle to decipher their cryptic messages, we can rest assured that the dream inherently comprehends us. The renowned Swiss painter Peter Burkhäuser vividly captured this dynamic after dreaming of the Puer Aeternus, subsequently illustrating a magnificent, celestial boy riding a wildly powerful steed. Emerging from the vast cosmic expanse of the collective unconscious, this brilliant figure streaks across the mental horizon like a nascent star, representing a direct encounter with the archetype of the self. Depicted with 4 arms and grasping a mystical 8-pointed bloom, the youth perfectly embodies quaternity, serving as a universal symbol of spiritual completeness and divine wholeness. The visionary English poet and artist William Blake stands as a magnificent historical testament to an individuated soul who successfully harmonized with his own Puer Aeternus. He famously proposed that if our sensory gateways were properly purified, the universe would reveal its true, boundless nature to humanity, unlocking the profound mysteries intertwined between our internal and external realities. Blake beautifully articulated this enlightened perspective by expressing that true happiness stems from recognizing the world as a realm of pure imagination. While one observer might be moved to tears of profound joy by the mere sight of a tree, another merely perceives an inconvenient green obstacle in their path. As he profoundly summarized, a person's ability to perceive the miraculous magic of the world is entirely dependent upon the depth and character of their own internal vision.